I'm talking about planning, architecture, design, master planning. And why is that important? Well, we're actually in a very unique time. I mean, all of us know this image, I'm sure. We know what's happening in the world. Some of us are ignoring that, some of us are paying attention to that, but nonetheless, this is a very unique time in history. And when you think about not just climate change, but you think about the built world, the world I'm assuming we all work in, we have to do something to respond to that. And it's a very unique opportunity as well. There's also other forces at play. There's certainly, years ago we heard about peak oil and now it's disappeared, but nonetheless peak oil will be a reality and gas and oil prices will be rising. And that changes obviously the way we think about buildings, but it also should inform the way we think about city making, transportation, a number of other issues that relate to what we do. Another important factor, of course, is our aging population. And again, I'm sure most of us in the room are well aware of that, if not actually living it. So that's important to remember as well. But as we sort of dive down into some of the issues that this creates or contributes to, the idea of where jobs are is actually central to something I want to talk about today. So obviously all of us in this room are employed. All of us probably travel or a great or lesser extent to work. What does that mean in terms of the issues that this presents? What does it mean in terms of age? What does it mean in terms of consumption? What does it mean in terms of lifestyle and enjoyability of our places that we create? So even in dense cities, we find that there, and Vancouver is on this list as well, there is still a considerable amount of jobs that are not in the downtown. Vancouver is actually pretty good at that. The cost from a CO2 point of view is enormous. So basically we're comparing here metropolitan areas with a fairly long commute and those with a much shorter commute. And obviously Vancouver's there on the right-hand side. I won't name the US city on the other side. There's also efficiency in terms of distances. So this is actually a chart from New York State comparing various smaller towns in New York State. And you can see here on the bottom the distance in miles that people have to travel and the efficiency of that or lack of efficiency of that. Interestingly, most jobs in this region tend to be fairly distant. 10 miles is a pretty good distance. So just to pause for a moment and sort of set the framework for this presentation. This presentation is essentially about two things. One is building use and zoning and what we can do to think about that differently in terms of our city-making process. In particular, looking at employment and industry differently than we may have in our history. And the second is sort of a future and past look to try to understand what we've done in our planning world and in our work and what we might do, what's coming that we need to think about. This is an image. Oops, can you skip one, please? This is an image of many places in North America. It's suburban sprawl probably at its worst. I mean, I certainly grew up in a neighborhood something like this in Greater Vancouver. I'm sure many of us did, and some of us still live there. It's not that that's not a part of the fabric that should continue necessarily, but we need to think about the amount of it we make. Even in Vancouver, a city that's very famous for its dense urban places in downtown, we still build in the region more single-family houses in the valley than we do homes in our downtown core. So there's something there that we have to think about. This is a major reason for that. North America, unlike Europe and Asia and other parts of our world, started their cities in a very different way than we did. We're a very new place. In Vancouver, I often say, it's probably the newest city on the planet. When you think of 125 years ago, everything outside this window was not there. It's pretty remarkable. But the car, had a huge influence on that. And in American cities, it really had a devastating effect. If you think of most American cities you've been to, it's only recently that we're starting to look at those downtowns again. And people are considering those as places to live and maybe work. So in Vancouver, I don't know how many of you know this, but I bet a few of you do. This is actually the freeway plan for downtown Vancouver from the 1960s. So this is the downtown core, Falls Creek. This is the freeway that would have come in from the airport. There's an interchange here that would have wiped out a good chunk of downtown. These are all raised freeways, by the way. Of course, the only thing that was built were the viaducts in the city, for better or worse, is looking at taking those down right now. Strathcona, the downtown east side, would have been very different and segmented into pockets of neighborhoods. And let's not forget this, which is actually pretty common to most American cities at the time. This was a Seattle engineer that designed this. So if you remember Seattle's waterfront, San Francisco's waterfront before the earthquake, Boston, Toronto, on and on and on. We would have had none of the waterfront connection parks, the convention center in the way we do today. We would have been split off from the water. And we would have, of course, also had a major effect on the ocean's landscape as well. Of course, that never happened, thankfully, thanks to all the great people of Vancouver in the past. One of the other slides, this is more for audiences outside Vancouver, but it's still worth noting where we live and why looking at Vancouver is a very unique situation as a laboratory. So essentially, if you look at what we have to work with, there's not a lot there. We've been forced, if you've grown up in the city, to look at height, look at density, look at the way we transport ourselves very differently than other jurisdictions. And there's also other factors like the agricultural land reserve, and we're looking at that now, but it's even a more minute space that we have to work with. And so what did that result in? That resulted in a lot of density very early on, and there's a lot of numbers quoted about the West End and Manhattan. I can tell you that the downtown peninsula of Vancouver is the second most dense area in North America next to Manhattan, but it is far from being as dense as Manhattan, just to sort of set the record straight. This is an example also from the 1970s that is a very different way of thinking about urban places, and it's not about the car. I'm sure most of us drive down there when we go there at Granville Island, but there's a very different relationship between the street edge buildings, loading of vehicles, for instance, right, that happen on the street that we designed into this. It's very different than other parts of our city, and in fact, most of the continent. But unlike Granville Island, a lot of our waterfront is actually very, very sanitized. So this is one of the few examples of some commercial activity on the rest of our beautiful seawall. And there's some reasons for that. One of the reasons is that our strata corporations, our mini governments that control a lot of our high-rise buildings, have a lot to say about what happens around them. If things are too noisy, if there's too much exhaust from a restaurant, they have something to say about that. And in fact, the restaurant just down the road here that's tucked into the bank near the convention center is no longer allowed to have a deep fat fryer. So you cannot get fries with your hamburger, you can only get salad. And that's because of the strata corps having something to say about that. So another thing to think about when we're trying to think about how we make our places, is that an appropriate way to respond to things? This is an image of Melbourne, which is oftentimes competing with Vancouver to be arguably the best city in the world, the most livable city. But Melbourne has a lot of things Vancouver doesn't, and these days is actually sort of beating us, nudging us out for number one. And one of those things it does have is grit. It has grit in a way that our waterfront, as fantastic as it is, we don't have. Our downtown doesn't have. And it takes advantage of things that we do have. We actually have laneways in Vancouver that we ignore in the downtown. We have dumpsters, telephone poles, the odd person wandering through. But in Melbourne, they actually have incredible vibrancy, coffee shops, activity. I think there's an opportunity in our city and other cities to look at that. So moving back to the car, I've sort of varied off into a little mini history of Vancouver. But the main issue we need to be thinking about is commuting, trips, and how absurd we have actually, the design of our cities is actually being, and Vancouver has a part of that as well. On the other hand, one of the things we do right is when we build buildings at least, whether they be car-oriented or more mass transit-oriented, we actually approach the street in a very sophisticated way. This is something Vancouver does as well as any city in the world. And to give you an example of the opposite, this is Nashville, which is a could be anywhere, but it's Nashville. Nashville is a very vibrant, growing city, adding population, one of the few centers in the States that did fairly well through the recession. Yet, they're building new buildings. This is actually a residential building. I mean, there's a clue there because there's a few balconies, but it's not doing a lot for the future of the city in terms of how it engages the street. It's another important factor. What else do we do in Vancouver? Well, we build a lot of these. We sell them very fast. We build them very fast. And frankly, even as an architect, I think we're not considering these very well. I think Vancouver is actually going to look pretty shabby in a few years. And it will look shabby for a long time because we built a lot of these structures that don't have the ability to be something else. The floor to floor is very tight. They're not going to become office. They're not going to adapt to changing needs within the city. They're not even very adaptable in terms of suite to suite, most of them. You know, you're locked into a very finite design. So obviously there's a lot of great things that come with this, including population downtown. But nonetheless, I think we need to think about those structures. We know that we can reduce single occupancy car trips. This is an important chart from the city of Vancouver, which is essentially saying that we've added a lot of people to the downtown, but we've actually radically reduced the amount of cars in our downtown. So obviously we're doing something right, but we need to do more of that. What we're looking at now in the region is actually corridors of population, because Vancouver, as you probably know, is going to add a lot of people in the next 25 to 30 years, up to another 1 million people in this region. Where are they going to go? Well, they could go to Langley and Abbotsford and Chilliwack, and if we keep doing what we are doing, they probably will. But there's also a lot of opportunities closer into the city along transit that are important to look at. And so if we look, this is an interesting slide because people tout Portland as being a great American example of transit. There's actually free transit downtown Portland, so it is an outstanding example of a transit-oriented city. But even within that, there's obviously a ton of sprawl. And the other thing that Portland's known for is a growth boundary, which is lauded as one of the great things in North America. But the growth boundary in reality is so far out that it's almost like being in Langley anyway. So I question how well that's doing in Portland. So what have we forgotten? I think one of the things we've forgotten is how to do sort of smaller towns well, smaller nodes well, compact places. And we actually, before the car, we actually had figured that out pretty well. We've also forgotten that in those smaller nodes that we used to build, we actually had all the uses, right? I mean, this has a road in front of it now, but it would have been a trail and it would have had horses and you weren't able to travel as far. And so you had the blacksmith and the butcher and the baker, and you had homes above that, and you had hotels, and you had all of it within about as compact a form as you could build in wood frame. I'm not saying that we should build this again. I'm just saying that we knew how to do this even in North America many, many years ago. And we also have a lot of examples in our roots coming from Asia and from Europe of places that predated the car and also knew how to put everything together and are some of the most fantastic places in the world to this day because they're walkable and there's still employment and there's still vibrancy. So just some lessons about smaller places. So we are starting to get this. We are starting to build better and we're starting to fix past errors. And we're looking at different transit types. So this was heartening to me. I do a lot of work in Calgary and our firm has a big presence there, and it's not someplace you think of as being transit-oriented for sure. But nonetheless, the thinking is coming, and it should be a great help to that city. I think already you can see downtown Calgary being more vibrant as more housing is created there to go with the jobs. On the Lower Mainland, there's been recent investigations, charrettes, that sort of thing, looking at how to mix industrial and residential and locating, can't read that very well, but locating jobs around nodes within them. We do a lot of other things well related to density that aren't just about jobs. This is actually very rare in most cities. In Vancouver, we talk about about childcare. We think about 3-bedroom units in buildings. We think about child play spaces in our downtown core. I can tell you the Pearl District in Portland, for instance, which is very famous for being dense and a very cool neighborhood, and it is. I encourage everybody who hasn't been there to go there, but there are no families there. It's really a different demographic. We do amazing public space in Vancouver as well. You know, despite my tirade about the waterfront, we actually do some pretty cool waterfront spaces. We allow the public to inhabit those spaces, very unlike other cities. Very important when you're talking about transportation, when you're talking about creating jobs and living together, you need to have great public space. And the street edge, I've showed you a commercial example of what we do on the street edge. This typography of having a transition, and it's very well illustrated here, between public space and private space is actually very sophisticated. It looks like a few steps and a little patio, but it really is about how humans occupy space and how they understand it as they go through it. Very sophisticated. Other places do public realm very well, probably better than us. This is, who knows what this is? This is Montreal. Obviously not in winter. But this space, the great thing about this space and some of the spaces around it is it transforms itself in winter to just as active and usable a place. In fact, it attracts children and attracts people of all ages with simple structures that I think are quite brilliant. Things we could learn from and other cities could learn from as well. So back to industry. I've shown you some of the things that make cities good in their downtown when they're done well. But what about industry? We have the zoning codes in North America that actually treat industry as this terrible smokestack thing that has to be pushed aside and as far away from the city and where people are living as possible. Well, I think all of you are familiar with this example. This is on Gravel Island. This is actually about as industrial as you can get, and it's right across the water, as we all know, from thousands of people living. There's people living all around it. There's tons of activity. This is an extremely good example of how to put industry in the city. And my argument, by the way, is not really about dirty industry. It's about the fact that industry has changed radically. It's more about jobs. Most of the industry jobs in Vancouver are not like this. They're actually a lot cleaner than this. But if we can do this, we should be thinking about job space very differently. That was more of a density slide there, but just to illustrate the density and relate it to greenhouse gas emissions. Look at our downtown core in Vancouver. This is almost down the 1 ton that we all aspire to. It's a very impressive number and illustrates how putting everything together works. But jobs are very much the key components. Other aspects of jobs and public realm. So this is a redevelopment of the CBC, for those of you that don't know that. There's hundreds of people working in this building, but previously they were cut off from the street. This is an example of a place for engagement within the city related to jobs. And another part of the CBC as well, where people in midday free concerts in the summer come to congregate as well, related to jobs. More on the public space. Now, what about the other areas around our downtown, around other downtowns that are single family? Well, there's many examples. This is actually in Strathcona of buildings that can become more dense than single family. This is a single family lot with 6 homes on it. And I think the fabric is pretty obvious that it's not a tower, it's not the things that people are afraid of in their neighborhood. There are other forms of development that can radically increase the density in cities. And obviously the way we get around in Vancouver is unique. So we have an election coming up. I'm very curious to see what all this will mean. Maybe the pendulum has swung a bit far. I'm arguing about not having cars because I'm a Vancouverite, but nonetheless, I try to turn these corners sometimes, and I'm terrified of hitting some of these people because it's a very different way of experiencing the city. We didn't grow up with, lights that don't change and setbacks for cars that are many meters away. Now, I know there haven't been any serious accidents, but as we layer more and more of this on our city, I think we have to be careful to have a balanced approach and one that continues to look at supporting mixed use, right? So we need jobs, we do need some vehicles in the town. But back to my point about the tower form, do we really want this? I mean, you know, I love Vancouver, but nonetheless, I mean, this is like one palette. One of my partners actually did a tour of Granville Island a few years ago to some Danish folks, designers, people from the industry, and they were looking back on Granville Island, the city, and one of them turned to my partner and said, "Do you use architects in Vancouver?" So I think we, you know, we rest on our laurels, and we really have to start thinking about this.
Sorry, how much of that is, oh boy, probably somebody from the city of Vancouver here, but anyway, how much of that is architects, and how much of that is driven by City Hall planning department?
Or the developer.
It's a
And the budget.
So, by the way, I've designed some of these.
Yeah, but let's face it, the city definitely has very specific ideas around how buildings should look. One doesn't have to look at too many buildings downtown. I'm trying to think which one it was. Was it Shangri-La, which is half one type of glass and half the other?
No, it's
yeah. So, you know, not only was that the look and the feel of the city, but the city decided on the level of reflectivity of the glass. So when you look at this, if somebody came along and said, no, I want my building to be bright pink, I don't know whether that would have made it through the planning department.
Well, I do have first-hand experience in this, so I can answer that pretty clearly. I mean, there are a number of factors, you're right, but the first factor is actually the developer. So there is a formula to these towers that is being now regimentally followed, and it's followed in other cities. We're exporting this around the world from Vancouver, and San Diego was the first landing place for it. So what happens is we're trying to build these floors as quickly as possible. We've now got it down to 6 days per floor by flying the forms, pouring everything in the forms, all that stuff. So immediately that gets a repeated floor plate structure. The total floor plate is decided by the city, that's true. But the glazing is actually developer driven as well. So window wall is the preferred, cheapest solution. The other dirty story of Vancouver is many of these buildings are going to start to leak. Window wall is the next stucco. So I could talk to you for an hour about that, it's sort of a tangent, and maybe after the speech we could do that. But there's a lot of factors leading to where we got to. I'm just saying we need to think about it. So I'm going to veer off just for a minute because people always want me to talk about this subject. This is a theory on how to cast lasting urban development and have vibrant places by mixing things together, basically. And it's a branded piece of what we do. It's not a panacea, it's not the solution to everything, it's just a way to get people to think about placemaking very differently. And it's all about people. It's people driven, unlike the tower shot I just showed you, which tends to be monetarily driven and some other city-led formulas. This is very much turning that inside out. And the opposite example is actually malls, which has been the idea of retail and trade and to some degree production historically, but they're really a symptom of the card that I brought up earlier. And they're not made for life. They're made to bait you and get you in and keep you there as long as possible. That's actually what they're there. And so on a citywide basis, we look at a kind of baited city where you look at retail very differently than you used to, say, in the Wild West, where you would have these pieces in here, or Granville Island, which has all of them, for instance. And vitality is about shopping. It's not about real vitality. And when you look at diversity in places generally, we've tended to look at how we design things and think about things along very standard demographics of race and gender and sex and that sort of thing. But what we're thinking of is something quite different. And that there are actually cultures within urban places now that are actually a more important demographic. So subcultures that actually are about lifestyle, about hanging out together and forgetting about all those other reasons we separate ourselves into categories. You can almost argue this is an example today. I mean, it's an industry example, but nonetheless, that's my point. So in the old model of design, and to some degree in Vancouver, form is argued to be driving vitality. So form is the first thing we think about. You know, is it a tower, is it a mall, is it whatever? And then we kind of think about the people later. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but nonetheless, that's basically what happens. What we're saying is to turn that inside out and look at activities and how people hang out together as a more interesting way to look at city making and frankly, to do business. So we throw this in here because it's another way of separating people, but nonetheless, the intent of this is that we have everybody there. So it's not the typical demographic. We want places where people actually feel comfortable to be themselves, hang out, and enjoy life. And again, Gravel Island would be the obvious example. Dynamic places, connected places, places where you can do everything but are focused, at least initially, around a subculture of activity. So, I mean, there's thousands of examples of what those activities could be. Could be any type of recreation. Could be, you know, this is an example of a city hanging out and having a biking festival. But I mean, if the place itself was about selling bikes and repairing bikes and making bikes, that's what I'm talking about, right? There's a core culture to the place of why people go there. And there's 5 aspects of that. And there's a little video which will explain this better. But these are essentially the ingredients we find that need to be there to make a place vibrant through time. So I'll give you a 3-minute video.
We find that most people are attracted to these kinds of environments, not for an ethical or moral reason, but attracted to it because it offers a much greater quality of life. And what in the quality of life is it that's more attractive? It has to do with the animation that exists there. It has to do with the full experience of what they get when they're there. And one of the things that we're trying to understand is how can we start to describe these environments? What kinds of settings are such that we can start to dissect them, if you like, so that we can then go out and start to design them.
My partner, Norm Watson, and I had a real opportunity to be a pioneer in mixed-use development. We were the authors of the redevelopment of Granville Island in Vancouver, and this is something that dates back to the mid-70s.
Granville Island is pretty unique because it's the second most visited destination in Canada next to Niagara Falls. So through time, if you were graphing the amount of people that are there, it continues to ramp up. It's the unofficial heart of the city of Vancouver, where people hang out in a very unique and relaxed way.
We have an incredible diversity of uses. So sitting right next door to a cement plant is an art school. Next to it is a fresh food market.
The fact that you can trip over boxes of cabbage and the garbage of the market and artists doing their work on the streets and people from all over the world is by design. There's no curbs, there's no loading areas, there's a mixture of all sorts of things. That's by design. Urban Maintenance itself comes from the highly respected planner Mark Holland, who took it upon himself to look at Granville Island, take it apart piece by piece, and try to understand why, after 35 years, it continues to build on its own success and be more successful.
Traditional planning codes are all about separation. They're all about saying, well, put your employment over here, put your industrial over here, and put your residential over here, which is really the opposite of urban maintenance. Urban maintenance is about complexity. It's about bringing everything in close and saying, you know what, we need to mix those things up.
There's 5 major ingredients to a place being successful by design. A retail experience, but not a traditional retail experience. One that is very much of the place. It's not a foreign brand or box. It's built of where it is. The second would be production on site, which we've kind of lost, especially in the Western world over time. So if we bring that back, and Granville Island certainly has that, where people are actually making things that are being sold, at least some of them on site, and there's an authenticity about it. The cement factory, which is against all zoning to have a heavy industry, but it's being fought for by our firm, by Dialog, for years to be there, because it's the last piece of the authentic waterfront in Vancouver. And it works brilliantly. The barges animate False Creek. There's blue-collar employment downtown. There's an understanding of where concrete is made, and it's not a sort of separate, sanitized piece. It's part of the city. That's what we need more of. The third would be an educational piece, so that if you're taking one of these elements, you're selling it, you're building it, but you're also teaching everybody how to use it, make it do it. The landscape needs to be derived from the authenticity of the activity as opposed to an architectural imposition the other way. So it's very much a part of the fabric. And the final one is more of a celebratory aspect, which is festivals, events, things that build on the magnet.
To create an urban magnet, I think having traffic there, it's pedestrian traffic, it's vehicular traffic. I mean, there has to be a flow of why people are in a part of the city. If you stop at any street intersection, there's hundreds of pedestrians walking through. Likelihood, something's working well.
And that's very much kind of the urban magnet type of an idea is what is there, and we want to understand that so that we can actually start to design around it. What is there that is attracting all these people? What is there that can be an attractor for all these people? 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 12 months of the year.
So I include that because it's much prettier than me standing here trying to explain everything. So hopefully that helped. But what about the car? What about the idea of the car? Granville Island is a place that's very fundamentally built around the car. It's not the first mode of transport, but it's got to be there to stay, right? If we look at Granville Street downtown, we've been involved as a firm trying to bring the cars back to Granville Street, actually. We think it would add more vibrancy to the place. It's not you want to have thousands of vehicles congested there, but it's not a real street necessarily. Now, there are examples of places without cars that are fantastic. Of course they are. But they tend to rely on the tourist industry to a large degree. And despite Granville Island's amazing numbers, it doesn't rely on that. It relies on the local market first. And, it's not a universal recipe to do this. I mean, there's so many examples. I mean, Granville Street in the 70s was atrocious. You can look at the downtown Calgary, which has a non-vehicular street, which continues to be not great. There's many examples of not great places that don't have cars. But on the other hand, the car creates this type of development, which, as pretty as that may be, is still not sustainable in the long term for anything, not just greenhouse gases, but for livability and how we want to live in our lives. So essentially what we're saying is stop splitting everything apart and bring everything together. So what we actually need is pieces of all of these things. There's no uniform way to design a place or city or a region or a town. But we've got to start thinking about things differently. We've got to start including the missing parts of industry and jobs in the city. And that may be in a three-dimensional form, it may be in different forms, but we have to do that. And especially in the US, I mean, this is a weird statistic, but through the recession and before the recession and now, there are millions of available jobs in traditional manufacturing. The jobs that aren't shipped out of the US, that are actually available for people, they're low to medium wage, but nonetheless, they're vacant jobs. And part of my argument, especially in the US, is that if your cities weren't so split apart where those people had to drive for an hour or more to get to this low-paying job or medium-paying job, if they walked out their door and it was there, I bet you that number would change. So it has other ramifications than just how we build cities. But what about the future? What are we looking at as things change? Well, the car continues to be an issue that I don't think we think about properly. We're now swinging the pendulum all the way over to where everybody is going to bike and walk, which I don't think is realistic. And we have an infrastructure in North America that's built for cars. Now again, I'm not saying we should build more freeways, I'm not at all saying that. But what I am saying is, this is coming, right? The idea of automated vehicles is coming. It's already in all the big manufacturers. What does that mean for our cities? How do we think about that? Does that change the width of the bike lanes downtown? Does it change the streets? Does it change the way we think of business and buildings? It's important to consider. And there's also other things that are happening. And these vehicles exist. This car is 6 or 7 years old. This is a non-emitting vehicle that's more of an urban town car. Well, if ever there was a place where this might work, it's probably downtown Vancouver. What does that mean for our streets? What does it mean for parking? The amount of parking we have under all these towers is underutilized today. What does this mean? I think we need to consider these things. There's also stackable robotic cars. This is MIT, and I know it seems like a fantasy, but I've been to MIT, I've seen these cars, I've sat in one, and they've been designed for 7 or 8 years as well. They're definitely coming. And they change the way we think of space utilization as well, both in the public realm and in relation to buildings. And what about, instead of always putting, in Vancouver especially, townhomes on the street, and then maybe some retail if somebody thinks it's viable, what about real jobs? And I'm not talking about live work necessarily, I mean real jobs on the street. What's the issue with that? This building is actually across from the off-ramp of the Granville Bridge coming into Vancouver. It's looking at a concrete wall. So I'm also arguing not just about that, but about thinking about things three-dimensionally. So we tend to, zoning, if you look at zoning, is a two-dimensional map of the universe, which thinks that everything is there. I mean, in reality, there could be layers of verticality to that we're not thinking about. And I think we really have to get our minds around that. It's an ancient way of thinking in places. We also need to think about incubating activity, commercial activity, capitalistic activity, if you will. I mean, there's so many people that when they're given the opportunity to thrive and start a business, they will do so. And if those types of places along streets and other places that maybe are not supporting retail can think about that differently, maybe they're even subsidized because there's so much value in the residential above it that those spaces can be used for that. Granville Island has done this throughout its history. Places are starting to think about that. There are many, many cities, I just put this slide up. This is St. Louis, where they're looking at incubation very seriously. In Miami, very much so. Now, these were spawned out of the recession, but nonetheless, they're valid ways of thinking about city making. And this, which I think is one of the coolest examples I've ever seen, which is in Nashville. This is a single-family lot that the fellow convinced the city could essentially be retail. People drive, of course, to this place en masse because there's such cool retailers in here. These retail units are between 150 and 350 square feet. So the actual outlay of cash for these people is tiny. But on a per foot basis, this guy is making a lot of money. And what happens is these folks are now viable enough and their brand is known well enough that they're leaving this place and starting more traditional retail shops throughout the city. So an awesome example of incubation. But why put so much attention on jobs? Well, right now it's a very important part of who we are, but there is something else coming as well. And that is the fact that routine physical and mental work is becoming more and more automated. We have 3D printers. We have employment in factories and farms reduced by about 400% in the last 50 years. Things are becoming more automated. So there's another industrial revolution coming. And I'm not going to give you all the answers to how we deal with that. I'm just saying it changes things. If you can produce something on a 3D printer in your basement, that's a space idea changes. That could be a small apartment. It could be a place on the road. It's a different way of thinking about space. And the supply chains change too. So transportation changes with it. Port cities change. The movement of goods change. Where people hang out changes. So what I'm saying is we also need to think about live making because that's coming as well. It's not a fantasy, it's actually here. So what our city doing? So just as a summary, I hate putting words on slides, but I'll flash through these very quickly. Essentially, people ask me to summarize the thoughts of what I'm saying. So we need to increase the proximity of daily functions. That's what I'm driving at. We need to protect grade level uses for job and retail space. We need to think about the way we plan and zone things to legally disconnect that ground floor. So there's parts of the city of Vancouver, for instance, between Cambie and Main and 2nd and Broadway, where if you look at the morphology of the city, it dips down to 2- and 3-story buildings, and only job spaces are allowed in there. How is that sensible in a city that wants to have mixed use and transit-oriented activity? They're trying to preserve industry, that's their thought. I'm saying preserve it on the lower floors. Think three-dimensional. There's also affordable housing opportunities within that. I mean, in Vancouver, this is the biggest issue we face in the next few years, and we face now. If we think about those land uses differently, where there's jobs downstairs, maybe there's opportunity in what we call industrial zones now for more affordable housing types above that. The city often argues, well, this is complicated and messy, and my argument back is you control that. You control the taxation of the piece of land. You can separate it in 3 dimensions. It's done all the time. And by doing this, you're going to increase the availability of job space throughout the city and change the way all of these questions get answered. So in terms of planning, what should we do? I think we should think about uses first and what they actually are, not what we call them, not I zones and other zones that we think are heavy industry. They're not heavy industry. Certainly not in Vancouver and in many other places. Forget about the zoning, look at the local DNA, look at the cultures that inhabit places and start with that instead of imposing something from the outside. Focus on incubating growth, activity, and vibrancy. And think about the principles of urban magnets as a way to think about nodes differently in our cities and think three-dimensionally. So very quickly to end off, people always ask, well, where's this happening? What are the examples? Well, obviously Granville Island is the example we all know and understand, so that's the first one, but I won't stay on that. The one that's pretty dear to my heart right now is in Memphis, of all places. Memphis is a city with 20% unemployment. It has been like that since before the recession and since the recession. It's not recession-oriented. It's a very depressed city. It has a lot of old vacant buildings and derelict parts of the city. And we were invited to actually use urban magnets theory and try to rejuvenate a part of this city through the restructuring of an old Sears warehouse building. The 1920s structure, about 1.5 million square feet. It is a huge elephant sitting in this derelict part of the city. And our clients wanted us to apply the various ways, in this case, wellness, education, food, and art, those are probably hard to read, as the magnets is what we came up with. So this is kind of a strange terminology, but nonetheless, this is the shape of the building. I'll show it to you in a moment. And we started to look at not just the building, but the neighborhood. This is a 16-acre site, but it touches a derelict part of the city. We also, this is the footprint of the building here. We also looked at what happens in the outside of the buildings. How are the streets activated? How do people hang out there? What do they want to do? And we actually came up, this is one slide of about 20 of the various uses that can happen outside. So currently the arts group there has something called Memphis, where they bring in people to pay $50 to $100 a plate. They have visiting artists that come in and show whatever they need to show, and the people actually, great festival, but they actually vote on who gets $10,000 at the end of the night as a struggling artist to go out into the world and do something. So that's one. Farmers markets, we had outdoor theaters, you name it, happening in this space. So the building itself, I'll just jump forward for a second. This is actually the structure. This is a huge parking structure, and the spaces outside are all of this, which is a lot of land to deal with. This neighborhood is, they've got rents of like $5 a foot for retail, and they're still probably 60% vacant. It's a very tough neighborhood. But just to go back, what we did is we cut a huge atrium into the building as a way of sort of orienting yourself in this huge structure. All these various uses are visible in that structure. So we have, believe it or not, a high school in here. We have heavy and light industry. We have a big focus on medical, so it's a health and wellness facility. The idea is that you get kind of a full service of health. There's even free healthcare in the south of the U.S. that will be coming out of this building just because of the way it's designed. We're growing food on site and delivering that to the health and wellness aspect. Fresh food market, 4 floors of residential along the top, which includes visiting spaces for artists and the medical group. So it's a pretty cool mix of things. It really is about jamming everything together. We have just finished the construction documents for this. It went out for tender. It's on budget. They're going to start construction in 2 to 3 months. So it's actually real, which is amazing even to me. I didn't think this would actually come to fruition. But again, and we can zoom in on this slide, but it's very much about the outdoor-indoor relationship and how all these activities function at various times of the day and night, because it's a complex set of functions. So other places, this is Salinas, California, which is another depressed city, mid-sized city, about 100,000 people just south of San Francisco. So this is the coastal 101 that comes down, rail tracks. This city has actually got a historic white neighborhood on the west towards Carmel and Monterey, and a newer farm-oriented Hispanic community on this side. This is currently a complete wasteland of mostly empty parking lots, lots of crime, strange people wandering around. Our client has looked at turning this into the glue that joins the city back together, and they wanted us to apply urban magnets to it to think about what that would mean. So we took food again as a magnet, but it's a very different magnet here because most of this, the salad and probably things in this room that we eat actually come from this whole valley right here. This is a farming center. It's also the grapes of wrath history for those of you that know that. So I won't go into a lot of detail here, but there's a large market square for vendors to bring food. There's other food-related activities around that, hotel, residential. There's actually another strange magnet, which is cars. The Hispanic population really loves their vehicles, and they detail them, and they jack them up, and they put mags on them, and all that sort of thing. So there's a whole other component of a car magnet. And this one, I think this is the last one. This is downtown Los Angeles. So this is the downtown of the city. This is the Harbor Freeway cutting through in a slot. Disney, for those of you that know, is up above there. This is currently an active film studio called the LA Center Studios. We were invited to come down and look at a very large 14-acre parcel and turn it into a place, basically. So this was done in 2006, and you know what happened in 2008, so this went on hold. But we are back there working as we speak, so it's come back to life. But what we wanted to do was take the film industry as the magnet. I mean, it's what could be more LA than the film industry. So we didn't invite the Gap in for the retail or anything like that. We've got set makers and stage makers and costumes and industries related to that that are local, of the local DNA on site. We also have kept the film industry on site. So the streets are going to be designed as movie sets, and they'll continue to have filming rights on them. There's also a ton of jobs related to that. I mean, there's 1,500 people working on that site right now. So our idea is that, I mean, the weather's obviously pretty cool, so we're going to, you know, hang out and have people occupy the streets at different times, festivals, all that sort of thing, related to the magnet. So everybody's going to understand what's going on here. And it's much more real than, say, Staples Center, which is a great development, but this is really authentic fabric. And that's it. Hopefully I squeezed some time back for you. Thank you.